preserve, maintain, and rehabilitate structures. And the provisions allow for the county tax assessor to determine the valuation of property using an income method rather than a standard valuation, market valuation method. And this results in a substantial benefit in reduction in property taxes. What we're estimating is that typically it's a 40 to 60% reduction in those property taxes, which is, again, benefits the property owner because they can place those monies into the actual restoration, rehabilitation of the structure, which, as you know, these structures are getting older and older, and if we intend to try to keep these structures in good shape, there will be required funds necessary to maintain these structures. Staff research and investigation was completed. Again, we have had discussions with the City of San Clemente, City of Berkeley, and I also attended a conference in the City of Martinez to discuss with other planning officials the benefits and some of the problems associated with the implementation of the contracts. And we think we've come back with some proposals that will benefit and make the process easier, having learned from these communities. We have also had discussions with county tax assessor with respect to how we coordinate these contracts and when the deadlines they need in order for having these reassessed values. And unfortunately, we are late in the year. I would like to hopefully move the Mills Act contract onto City Council so we can get this adopted in the very near future, so we can actually get some of these contracts up by the end of the year. January 1st is the deadline that they've established to establish a reassessment for the following tax year. Of course, again, the Mills Act will have some impact to the budget revenue of those assessed values, but there is a range of property valuations, and I'll walk you through examples of that so you understand. In fact, the revenue loss is based on the type of property and the current assessed valuation. Again, a quick overview of the Mills Act program that we're proposing in the City of Santa Barbara. It is a pilot program. We're considering it a test to see exactly what the impacts will be as far as, again, the financial impacts, as well as how many contracts the city can manage at one time. So we will be coming back to report to you on the staff impacts associated with management of these contracts. For that reason, we've suggested 8 contracts per year, and the Finance Committee has also recommended that, which would be also a possibility of 2 commercial properties. But because of these revenue cap losses, there are limits as far as assessed valuation. We intend to adopt some administrative regulations that would incorporate these limits. Currently, if you see the draft ordinance right now, the city attorney drafted them with the idea of maybe inserting those caps into the actual ordinance. We feel it's more appropriate to put them in a council resolution. If they're subject to change, it would be much easier to go in there and, alter either the caps on the number of contracts, or if we're setting getting close to those limits, coming in and reassessing whether we could enter into any more contracts or extending those contracts further. These properties also are required to have a 10-year rehabilitation plan, so there is some monitoring required with our staff historian. We expect that to grow as the number of contracts grow, and that's another reason to come in and check with council in the future on what those implications are. We're suggesting a contract application and processing fee amount. We'd like to hear your thoughts on that, whether that is a reasonable expectation to pay for that process. Some communities keep it low, and the whole idea of an incentive program is to not charge a lot of fees, but other communities have a range of anywhere from $50 to $450 to either apply and or to process that contract. And again, we intend to adopt these program guidelines by resolution. Just to give you some idea of what staff is considering the eligible amount of properties that are in the city, we do have different designations that are afforded to city properties that have deemed to be historic, primarily focused on city landmarks and structures of merits, which are designated by council resolution. About 216 properties within the I think that's correct. 212 anyways. We also have included a group of properties that we're proposing that also could participate in this program, and this is where we have a future districting plan that we will come to council to present. And to be honest with you, we thought it would be appropriate to have these incentives in place before we entertain the idea of coming forward and telling neighborhoods that they're going to be part of a district. We might have some opposition to that, so we'd like to have a little bit of a carrot to approach to these designation of historic districts. We also, for the benefit of establishing what a contributing property is, are creating a new definition of a historic district, which is a little bit different than the original concept of a landmark district, which is outlined in our Chapter 2222, and the city attorney can have some more discussion about that difference and how it's crafted. So essentially 400 properties would be eligible. Now, some of these properties are broken up in such a manner that they are focused on either public buildings, school buildings. So obviously some of those nonprofit buildings would not be eligible because of the lack of need. And we also have some properties that would probably exceed the capped assessed valuation, which we're suggesting to be $2 million cap on property valuation. Any property above that, they would have to ask for special consideration, and we have a process to do so if for some reason we see a property that needs to have that type of program assistance in order to rehabilitate. But we're suggesting those caps to be in place to not deal with a very expensive property that would take a lot of funds out of the program. The fiscal impacts, again, our estimate back in 2007 was 6,000 to 15,000 impact maximum. We believe those were conservative. We don't expect 8 contracts per year on the program. However, that remains to be seen because the property owners have to agree to this contract. There's a performance requirement on making sure that these repairs, it's a commitment, it's a pledge to improve the property, so some property owners may not want to do so. The city of Santa Barbara receives 9.5% to 17% of the 1% tax revenue. That's how we've come up with some of these estimates. But there also is the potential, again, to impact other agencies or tax entities. And so we've contacted those tax entities, indicating to them that we are proceeding hopefully forward. And so there will be some cost fiscal impacts and reduction of tax to those agencies. And we're still in the process of having those discussions as far as the amounts and how it might affect them. The tax rate areas are defined by the county tax assessor. So the reason it varies, each colored area here in the city has different tax rates. And so based on the location, the tax assessor determines the actual assessed valuation. So this is just giving you an idea of where these resources would most likely be. And so we have a pretty good idea of those tax rates in those areas. This is an example of the Mills Act tax reduction and the benefits. This was taken from the city of Berkeley. They provide this example in a leaflet, a handout to property owners that are interested, just to get an idea of the types of tax savings that are possible. Here you have a tax assessment that went from $2,500 down to $688 with a tax savings of $1,812, and the city loss revenue for that was approximately $300. Obviously, when the valuation increases, the revenue loss increases. So again, another reason why we're establishing these caps on the total valuation of properties. Again, staff time impacts, we estimated them to be 40 to 60 hours. Again, based on our understanding that there would be a growth factor involved with implementation of contracts, and we would have to monitor the initial application submittal as well as do a field inspection, and in some cases do some periodic monitoring if there's some concerns about them not completing the work. And we do, and again, plan to report back in 2 to 3 years to see if those estimates were correct. We'll be monitoring those time commitments. So our staff recommendation with respect to Mills Act is that you review the application material and program guidelines and the qualification criteria and fees and have some comments on those to see if you agree with staff. Review the draft ordinance and provide any suggested changes and forward to council for possible introduction and adoption. Now I'd like to enter into the second component, which is the other incentives, and give you a brief description of those, and then we can return back to the draft ordinance. Okay. With respect to these code and zoning relief incentives, what we found with investigations with other cities is they do in fact deal with the same problem that we have, which is our older structures having the requirement to bring buildings up to current code, either with respect to parking or most commonly accessibility when in fact there's some type of conversion occurring. And what we've discovered is that there is a different philosophy sometimes with respect to allowing these uses in zones and encouraging more of commercial use in residential zones. Also, the use of the California Building Code can also be afforded to allow a much wider degree of solutions to meet code. And I'd like to walk through all of these solutions. We have a conditional use permit here also that is used in other cities to, again, allow more adaptive uses or small office uses in these historic districts when there's no expansion. We cannot allow somebody to expand a structure then try to get the same type of relief. There's also the idea of change of uses, and I'll walk you through some examples in the city of Santa Barbara that would be helpful if we offer some incentives. And then finally, we also recognize that these code incentives would need to be discussed further with either conversations and discussions with the Planning Commission, the Historic Landmarks Commission, and again, return back to the Ordinance Committee. So today we're seeking direction. If you concur, we'll do some more work with our city attorney to draft these up for your consideration. With respect to parking zoning modifications, the idea here is that there are two types of problems. When the problem is focused on the lack of parking for a property, how do you place parking on a very constrained site and meet accessibility requirements? Because often if you're going to a commercial use, you have to put a van accessible parking space. And that tends to sort of ruin the front of a building because building and safety wants it the most convenient, accessible space to the front entrance. They don't really like the rear access and having disabled wheelchair users have to walk up or wheel up the driveway. So it involves loss of site integrity and loss of landscaping. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not, we believe, the best solution. In some cases, we believe that there should be some relief to reduce or even waive parking altogether. And I'll show you some examples of that. So more discussion necessary on that solution. Some communities have actually findings for modifications, and we're not set on necessarily having it be a process where it needs to have a modification. We're also open to having a discussion with the Planning Commission and the Ordinance Committee with respect to maybe a waiver. Maybe the Historic Landmarks Commission would weigh on these findings and have them weigh in rather than the Planning Commission or the Historic Landmarks Commission. Those type of discussions we like to entertain in the future. Again, California Historic Building Code. What the code is really a performance-oriented code, not a prescriptive code. And what that means is that it's really based on what can you do to make the building safe versus really making a code change, code-driven change to the building. And what we've discovered, speaking with other planning officials, is the building officials become very rigid with respect to interpretation of the building code. They don't want to make exceptions or make it appear that they're favoring the building property owners. But the reality, this historic building code gives wide latitude to obtain a reasonable degree of safety. And in fact, there's very clear direction to building officials that you can use this to reduce the amount of building code change. And we've been a little bit frustrated working with our fire marshals sometimes when they say, no, you can't put that wood shingle siding back on. It needs to be changed. And I know our urban authority sort of gets frustrated with that. And so we'd like to be able to include that in our, list of incentives to make it very clear to our building official and local community that we are going to make some exceptions to try to give, some degree of restoration work to not impact that structure. And then finally, change of occupancies and use. We do know that there are older buildings in the city that are not in compliance with our zoning or codes. And the reason they're not in compliance is because either the property was zoned already commercial and they assumed they could just use it commercial, but the reality is that the conversion triggers new parking requirements, and there's no room for parking. And they feel compelled not to come to the city to discuss how to resolve these issues because there's an obstacle. So we'd like to have some possibility to remove those obstacles because they are low-intensity uses. There's examples of lawyers moving into these structures, or accountants, or some type of really low safety risk uses that could be resolved, and they could come forward and actually get building permits and not be afraid that they're going to get caught up in our zoning regulations. So we'd like to, again, encourage that these illegal uses be legalized. Here's an example, so you can see that sometimes our parking requirements drive where solutions are provided as far as parking, and we don't believe that's the best solution for how the appearance of structures should be geared towards meeting the parking requirements. Here we have, again, historic homes that don't have much room for parking, and there would be a problem in converting these properties if they needed to be converted and finding the appropriate parking spaces. So we feel if there's plenty of off-street parking, maybe that's the solution here, that we could waive the parking in order to have this move forward if we could make these findings. Again, another beautiful front yard, and having the problem with actually there's parking at the rear, but isn't covered. And again, accessibility is a problem. The building official would not accept the accessibility at the rear sometimes, and you're faced with tearing up the front yard to achieve parking. Here's another example of a lawyer's office that I think achieves the purpose, which is, again, there's pride in ownership. There's an improvement being made to the property to maintain, the habitability of the structure and the life of the structure, and we feel that's important to continue. So with that, I still would like to conclude this presentation with the idea that the Ordinance Committee, review the draft ordinance and offer as much comment you can on the Mills Act, as we'd like to move forward with that element. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Limon. Any questions from the committee? Do we have any public comment? Thanks. Callum DeForest. And
good afternoon. I want to commend, at last, the Mills Act is finally coming to Santa Barbara, hopefully, because it's been around for a long time and has been resisted for various reasons. And I just want to say it's about time. I think this would be a great plus to encourage the preservation of Santa Barbara's historic properties. And I want to commend those individuals and companies that have volunteered, almost 100% volunteered, to have their properties so designated as historic landmarks or structures of merit without any incentive. So this incentive will be a plus. And I also want to say that this is something that the Pearl Chase Society, the adoption by the City of Santa Barbara of the Mills Act has been something that the Pearl Chase Society has been pushing for years. Thank you very much.
thank you, Mr. DeForest. Tony Basallo, and I apologize, I believe you had a public comment on a topic not on the agenda. Is that correct?
Well, I'm going to convert it into an agenda topic.
Very good.
Because I am Tony Vasallo from Brinkerhoff Historic District, and one of the comments I made in one of the letters I sent to City Council included the idea of having the Landmarks Commission be able to review landmarks within the city and look at any dispensary within the sphere of influence of a historic structure. And I also recommended and asked for consideration for prohibiting marijuana dispensaries in the Brinkerhoff Historic District altogether. I did think you had that on the agenda today, misunderstanding the last board meeting that it was that item was put forward. And if you don't mind, I would like to submit a one-page list of comments for the dispensary issue when you bring it up.
Sure.
I can give that to this lady
Absolutely.
here. The only comment I would make about your the historical people is because I've worked on something like this in the past myself, and we included not only a tax incentive, but we also provided fixed rate, low interest 3% fixed rate mortgages for the duration of the rehabilitation process, and it worked quite well.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Hurst.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm a real estate broker in town. I've spoken with Mr. Limon before with my partner, Lori Hoffman, about the Mills Act as an idea. I've seen it work in other communities. Some close friend of mine has a house that's a historical property in the L.A. area that is in the Mills Act. And I think that one of the great things about Santa Barbara, and when we're showing properties, one of the great things is our architecture here, and I think that it behooves us as a city to try and maintain the beauty of some of these old homes. And a lot of times when you have somebody buying an expensive home, their resources are used up to try and keep the house in good condition or the property in good condition. And something like the Mills Act makes it very possible for them to do that. It brings up the values in the whole neighborhood rather than having a neighborhood that's kind of blighted with older properties. And so I would encourage you to give this good consideration, because I think it'll be a real good asset, even in the limited amount you're carrying it on for the community, and it'll help maintain and keep some of the great architecture we have here. So thank you.
Josh, did you want to? Okay, very good. And our final speaker will be Adam Ross.
I'm a property owner who owns a historic home, a city landmark home from 1879, and we love it. But I just want to let you know it is quite expensive to maintain. We recently painted it and sanded it down. It took 3 months to really get it looking good, and all the to give it a proper paint job that it probably hasn't had. And a lot of things are more expensive to maintain. To build a garage, it's more of a carriage house, and just all sorts of things kind of multiply. So I really support the Mills Act, and I think just to continue to rehabilitate the house, it will just be a tremendous incentive for me, and I know other people as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. If there are no more public comments, this is to the committee.
Yeah, I'm really glad to see this on the agenda. It's been a while, and I know these things sometimes just take perfection or something. We have to perfect them a little bit, and this looks really good now. I'm excited about being able to do this. I think people like Mr. Ross and so on are going to really enjoy that extra amount of money to have for fixing up the house, and I think the whole city will do better because of it. It'll be wonderful. I have a couple, just some almost routine questions,
Sure.
which is the kind of thing that I get to do because Doss isn't here. This is good. I have, there was on page, I'm looking at page 3 of the ordinance, and on the ordinance, well, first of all, there's the blanks, and you were saying, Mr. Limon, that you would like to maybe put those in a resolution instead, which makes a lot of sense to me, in case this council wants to change it or something like that. Is that?
Madam Mayor, that's exactly what we are suggesting, that those caps be introduced as part of a resolution.
Okay, so that whole...
And council would consider those caps at the same time.
Okay, so number 2 there would go away and would go into a resolution, which makes sense to me, and that's good. I have 2 questions then about the contracts. The idea is to make a contract with the homeowner. And by the way, the idea of Tony's idea of coupling it with our low-interest loans, because we do those loans for people, for low-income people. That would be a good idea to try to work those out. That sounds like a really good idea, but that's separate. Now, the contracts, it says here that minimum of 10-year term, which is good, and then it says automatic renewal yearly. And does that mean is that a rolling renewal, so you add another year after you finish a year?
Madam Mayor, that's exactly what the program does. However, periodically, we're going to have to reassess their 10-year improvement plan.
That's what I
So
was
the
gonna
agreement, it's a mutual agreement that we roll over if they in fact have additional repairs that they can lay out and forecast in the future. That would in fact happen.
Okay.
Ideally, again, we would have a point where the structure was totally upgraded and restored. But in fact, we do have properties that continue to be renewed in order to have them be maintained. And so we would be evaluating, working closely with our historian to see if it's a legitimate program to rehabilitate.
Okay, sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. The question here, it says, the contract shall be for a minimum 10-year term with automatic renewal yearly by either the city or the property owner. So if the city doesn't want you to, but the property owner wants to, how does that work?
Madam Mayor,
Or should it be and, city and
I'm
property
sure
owner?
Mr. Wiley will have comments on this, but what I wanted to assure you is that we had several dialogue and discussions with our city attorney on how we could terminate contracts, and I believe he can comment on where our position is on that matter.
Okay, okay, good. Mr. Wiley?
The first point is the renewal gets initiated by either party, but it has to ultimately be agreed to by both the city and the property owner. So,
Oh, okay.
and then and a concern has been expressed. Well, what if we don't want to renew it? What if the maintenance hasn't been according to plan? The work, we can always terminate the contract for breach at any period of time. The city can say, no, you haven't followed your plan. You aren't maintaining in accordance with your plan. And there's a process in the Mills Act for terminating the contract.
Okay, good. And then the last, that makes sense. The last question was, what if the property's sold? Because people do sell their properties. Does the contract go with the property, or is it with the person?
That's correct, Madam Mayor. It does transfer with the property.
Okay, so the ZIR or whatever would tell you that there is a contract with the city.
That's correct.
There's a notice recorded that the contract is in place on the title to the property. So
Okay.
it'll show up in your title report.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense. That's good. Okay, I think that's me.
Is that it? Okay. Mr. House.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick questions here. One of my concerns was effectively the performance and accountability on the part of the homeowner. I think that I'm beginning to find that on page 3 of the draft ordinance under 3 required provisions. But would you just walk us through the way that we would know that for the benefit the property owner is holding up their end of the bargain?
Okay. The standard operating procedures that I've discovered that other cities or communities fall into is really a question of a submittal of receipts and or information that confirms that this renovation is occurring, and we have different methods to track this progress, either through building permits, which are put in a file for that property that would give us a tracking of whether they're following through on that commitment to repair the property, and or a combination, again, of their 10-year rehabilitation plan that's periodically checked and or updated. And the idea is, again, that there is monitoring involved. What we found with other communities that there were some allegations of misuse, and we investigate those. We investigate whether, in fact, the property is being improved as such. And if they've committed to, like Mr. Ross says, to paint the property, we verify that the painting of the property has occurred. If it's not, then we revisit why that delay has occurred and what type of expenses are planned for that property. So we believe that we can monitor it to a point. Now, obviously, it's easier to monitor 10 contracts versus 50. So I may come back to City Council in the future if this program generates that type of quantity of properties.
And I guess one of my concerns, we have a number of properties in town which just driving around you can see that are that are pretty run down. They may very well be historic structures or qualify for this. My hope is that one of the benefits is these would get spruced up and have that benefit to the rest of the neighborhood that people have spoken to us about.
Councilwoman House, I do also want to comment, if I haven't mentioned it, that there is some degree of selection process that we, in fact, are going to be working with our urban historian and the Historic Landmarks Commission to recommend, if in fact we have an influx of property applications, the best candidates for these contracts. So we feel that they have made that commitment and that we could, in fact, benefit to engage in that contract.
Okay, very good. On page 7 in our draft ordinance here, J, it talks about the annual revenue loss to the city limitations here. And these, you have some numbers there with question marks next to them. Were you considering that this would be part of a resolution as well? Or do you want us to be weighing in on this today?
The caps and the discussion with respect to number of contracts, we believe that we presented that information and there was agreement at the Finance Committee to go forward with those.
Those are recommendations of the Finance.
That's correct. We didn't really want to open up that discussion again. We can get into the benefits of that, whether we should have 8 contracts or 5 contracts, whether we should have a lower cap limit. Those are obviously going to be considered at City Council when we adopt. You could weigh in at now if you so choose.
But the annual revenue loss to the city to exceed 30,000, or the loss from an individual property does not exceed 3,000. Those two numbers that are in J on.
That's correct. Any reference to those caps, we're going to move out of the ordinance, which may be subject to change.
All right, very good. That helps clarify that. Well, I just want to comment that I know that it's been a number of years, and for a long time while I was on Planning Commission, we were trying very hard to get these surveys going and completed. A lot of it really relied on volunteer effort, too, from the community in terms of the historic surveys, and we really appreciate all that. This is sort of on the other end of it, where we really have a chance to incentivize. I'm sure some would feel that in this current economic times, the city taking any hit whatsoever would be ill-advised. But there are, and I don't know how you do the real calculus of this, because when you honor your historic structures in a community and you have that be one of your high priorities and a key value for your community, I think that speaks well of the community and can really reveal itself and increase property values for the areas that are nearby and for the community at large. So there's got to be just some differential there, and I think that it weighs best in our favor to support this. So I know you may have some comments, but I'll be prepared to make a motion when you're done.
Okay, very good. I'm satisfied, very satisfied with the direction this has gone, and I think a lot of research went into this. It's carefully thought out. I'm glad that the Finance Committee has weighed in, and I think when I look at this, I say, 8 houses a year. We're not talking about a sea change. I think you said there were 212 landmark structures, or was it designated structures, as well as the potential for about 200 more when we pursue the historic districts. So that first 200 at 8 a year, that's going to take us 25 years. I think we will be going forward sufficiently slowly that if we find problems, we'll be able to do something about it in time. So I am quite happy to entertain a motion on this.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may, I move that we forward this on to City Council with the recommended changes in terms of what goes into a resolution as opposed to being in the ordinance that was just discussed.
Is there a second?
Second. But I would like to comment a little bit on the fee, because we didn't talk about that, and I'm getting more and more into cost recovery. I think we're having a hard time with our budget, but I don't know what a cost recovery fee would look like here. So, do you have an idea?
Madam Mayor, I think again, based on the research in other communities, a fair fee would be in the neighborhood of $400, $450. Now, what decision you could make is that some communities charge just an application fee, like $50 to apply, and then they don't charge the processing fee until they actually is a contract for the city attorney to review. And in this case, one of the elements is that we're trying to keep this simple process so it doesn't have to go to City Council. So our city attorney will be working with our community development director to initiate and approve these contracts, unless there's some type of nuance on the contract that deserves City Council attention.
Well,
so that'll keep the cost down a little bit.
Right, and the $50 to start the process seems like that seems very fair, and then from there go on. Okay, I'm satisfied.
And if I could
that
just
has to be part of the motion.
Right. If I could just comment on that as well, I think given the size of the tax benefit to the homeowner, I think it's reasonable for there to be maybe not full cost recovery, as close as we can get. I don't know how we would define full cost recovery on this, but I think the higher end fee that you're talking about makes sense.
Chair Francisco, the benefit of having discussed these contracts, we have boilerplate examples of contracts that other communities have had, and I think our city attorney has adapted that. So pretty much we have a standard contract that we just fill in the blanks and customize to that property.
Great. Very good.
Mr. Chair, do we need to reference this process piece today, or is that something that would be for future discussion or at council?
I think what we have today before us is this ordinance and the recommendation that I think everyone here agrees with, that we take the actual hard numbers out into a resolution.
But I was referring to the process piece of a small amount to start the process, and then the final due once it's been approved. I think that does make sense, and I think that's an appropriate thing. But is that something that would be in our decision today, or is that coming back later on?
Mr. Chair, could I weigh in on
Please.
this issue? Because I think actually the work won't be at the contract stage, won't be at reviewing and executing the contract. And in terms of cost recovery, I tend to think that the real issue will be the urban historian's work that'll come with the submission of the plan. There's an application and a plan, and they can be submitted separately. It doesn't really make sense to do that. But it's the submission of the plan, the review of that plan by the urban historian, and the working by the urban historian with the HLC to say that's an acceptable plan, let's move forward to a contract or not. And it seems to me that's when the money should be required, and not necessarily at the end of the process in terms of cost, if you're really concerned about cost recovery.
So more like a threshold, really, because this is going to take some staff time just to review at the very beginning. Once somebody puts in the wish to be in this, that's when the clock starts ticking for our staff. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very interesting. But anyways, I guess my question goes to, is that a today decision, or is that something that will be decided later once the resolution starts getting put together?
Councilwoman House, once we formulate the council resolution and look at our processing rules, we can establish the timing of those fees. Today, we wanted to get concurrence that there would be a fee. It sounds to me like there's support for a fee, and that whether we take the fee in at once or along the process way, we'll define that in our rules when we turn back to council, that we've decided that, in fact, that makes sense, that we collect the fee once or twice.
And Mr. Chair, I'm hopeful that we get, what I was hoping to do is get a nexus between the collection of the fee and the cost to the city, whether it's later at the end or whether it's at the beginning. To me, it's getting them connected in time. That makes it the important thing.
Right. Okay. Any more discussion? So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Very good. Meeting adjourned. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right.
I do want the committee to weigh in on maybe the 4 ideas that we presented, and
Sure.
See if there's general support for pursuing either one or all of these ideas. And we could walk through those again if you like. But I do want to know if you have any questions with respect, and whether you would initiate or initiate that we work with our city attorney to pursue those discussions.
And Mr. Chair, just to clarify, I see this as being an ordinance as well, maybe a new section of Title or Chapter 2222, where this would be the non-Mills Act, if you will, the non-financial incentives for preserving historic resources.
Right. I'll start off by saying I think with these properties we need to look at them a little bit differently than we do others. And I'm personally familiar with some of the problems in rehabilitating these structures. So I certainly think this is again something for staff and the ordinance committee to look at, is exemptions for particular historic structures. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I agree completely. I think this is a very, very important thing. And what I'd like, though, would be for us to really take some care as we draft this and try to look for any unintended consequences at the same time. If we allow for flexibility, we need to really make sure that we still look to the function as well first. If there's so that's just my concern about it. But I think we're on the right track, and we really want to do this. If you look at the Brinkerhoff area and how beautifully the people have restored their homes, most of that has been done and being managed to still have some modifications, but it's not been just wholesale. So, but given the flexibility is really an important thing, and I think you've got some good ideas up there.
No, I really agree. I really agree too. It's they're just common sense things that we would be. They're incentives non-monetary incentives, and that's a very good thing. So I think it's a good thing to be pursuing. And remind me, I know this is going to sound funny because I've been on this thing so long, but if you have a historic home and you're not in the HLC zone, the HLC still has jurisdiction over you, right?
That's correct, Madam Mayor. We revised the
Thought so.
ordinance to
Yeah.
expand their
Thank
purview
you.
outside EPV if it's been
Thank you.
listed or
Yeah, I
historic.
thought so, because that, working closely with HLC is very important here. They're really good at what they do, and it's very good to have that input. So I think all of these are very they're very worthy of using, especially the California Historic Building Code. It's a very good one.
So I move that we encourage staff to move forward with researching these other code and zoning relief incentives and bring back some sort of a draft ordinance for our consideration in the future.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Did it.
Anything else, Mr. Limon?
Thank you very much.
I did.
Meeting
Thank you.
adjourned.
Thank you.